What's up, Flow fans? April Dunnam here. Hope you've been enjoying the first ever online Flow conference like I have. And thank you for joining me for my session, Intro to the Flow HTTPAction. For those who don't know me yet, my name's April Dunnam. I'm a newly minted Microsoft MVP. I own a business called ThriveFast. We're a Microsoft partner located in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm also the leader of the Oklahoma PowerApps and Flow user group. We just had our first meeting last week, went really well, great attendance. By trade, I'm a developer. I did SharePoint development back in the day, but I love teaching others how to build apps and automate their business processes with zero code using tools like PowerApps and Flow. You can find me on Twitter at April Dunnam, and my blog is SharePointSiren.com. All right, that's enough about me. Let's get into the topic here. This session is targeted for the power user, the non-developer who might not be familiar with what an HTTP request is. So we're going to start by explaining the basics, what it is. Then we'll talk about what can it do for you as a power user, how you make it work, some tools that will help you along the way, and then we'll focus on demos, because everyone loves demos, right? All right, let's get started. So what is HTTP? HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It's the magic when you're sitting at your desk, you type in twitter.com or facebook.com or office.com. It sends a request to a server and you get a response back and your web page is served up. It's what makes the World Wide Web go round. It enables communication between clients and servers. So now we know HTTP is what enables the communication between the client and the server, but how is the data returned from the systems we're connecting to? So if we're connecting to Twitter, how are the posts served up? That's where APIs come in. An API is an application programmable interface. It's what developers can create to allow you to send a request to their service, and they can make this API that returns the data back. Some basics of an API: you have different HTTP requests that you can send to an API. These include GET, which reads content from a database. There's PUT, which updates and replaces a row in a database. A patch, which updates or modifies a row in a database. A post, which creates a new record in the database. And delete, which deletes from the database. So the client can send one of those requests, get, put, patch, post, or delete, to the REST API. The REST API is the code, and it talks to the database, gets what it needs to get, either gets the information, adds it, deletes it, and returns a response back to the client. These responses are typically returned in one of two formats, JSON or XML. All JSON and XML really are ways to describe data. So for example, say you submit an HTTP request to return information about a company, Berry & Associates, for example. XML would return the data in the structure in the left. As you can see, it's very HTML-like. So you have a name tag and the name of the company, a phone tag with the phone, street, city, state, etc. JSON would give you what's on the right there. So you would have these key value pairs. So key name, colon, value, Berry & Associates, phone, colon, the phone number. So I don't want to get too much in the weeds describing, the ins and outs of JSON and XML. Just need to know that there are ways of describing data. Flow actually supports both of these two syntaxes, JSON and XML. I wanted to throw this comparison up there though, because I definitely suggest using the Json syntax when working with Flow in the HTTP request. Reasons being, as you can see, JSON is the newer way of doing things. It's far more simple. It's based on JavaScript syntax. So if you have a choice, definitely use JSON over XML. As you can see from the little picture below, XML's the old bloated way of doing things. JSON's the nice lean way of doing things. Some of the APIs you're going to interact with might not support JSON yet, and you might have to use XML. But for the sake of the demos I'm going to be showing, we're going to be using JSON. So now that we've did a general overview of what HTTP REST APIs, JSON, and XML are, you might be wondering, okay, April, why do I care about this HTTP action? What can it do for me? There's several things. One, including the ability to architect long-running flows. So as some of you may know, flows have a 30-day run limit. One way to get around that is by using the HTTP action to call the flow and make it start over again. Another way that it's helpful is to build nested flows. For example, you might have 3 different document libraries out on SharePoint that all need the same basic approval process. Well, instead of recreating that approval process 3 separate times, you can create an approval flow and use the HTTP action to execute that approval flow from the 3 different libraries, and you only have to create it once. A way that I love using the HTTP action is with PowerApps. So say you're building a PowerApp application and you want to be able to return, scan a book and return information about that book. Well, you can call a flow from your PowerApp, and that flow can call the Google Books API and return the information about the book for you into your PowerApp. And lastly, as we know, Flow is great and has hundreds of different connectors for you to use. But odds are there's going to be some system that there's not a connector for that you want to pull information from or write information to. So instead of creating your own custom connector, which is a little bit more of an involved process, you can utilize this HTTP request action to pull and read information from those systems. Well, cool story, bro, right? Now we understand what HTTP requests are, what REST APIs are, and even how we can utilize them within Flow, but how do we know if the systems that we need to connect to have APIs for us to use? Thankfully, there's a website for that. If you go to programmableweb.com, this is a website that has a directory of almost any of the APIs you could think of out there. As you can see, as of right now, there are over 20,000 APIs for you to search for. So for example, if you wanted to know if there was an API where I could get nutrition information from, you can type in nutrition, search APIs, and it'll come back with a listing of all of the nutrition-related APIs for me to use. Pretty cool, right? I can look through this list, I can click on one of these, get more information about the API, I can find its endpoint, I can go to their website, figure out what I need to do to start using their API, and it's really as easy as that. I wanted to take the time to introduce you to your new best friend as you start working with these HTTP requests with inside Flow. That tool is Postman. You can go to getpostman.com and download this free tool. What it does is help you test out these API calls before trying to run them in Flow. Here's a brief look at what the tool looks like. So this is Postman. You can have several different collections of APIs that you're calling. As you can see, you can determine if you're doing a get or a post, and you can put in your REST API endpoint here and click send. In real time, it'll show you the response. So you can tell if there was any error for any reason on here, it would display an error. Otherwise, it would show you the response. So you can verify that it's working prior to trying to implement this within Flow. All right. Now that we got the basics out of the way, let's jump straight into our first demo. In this demo, I'm going to show you how you can call a child flow using that HTTP request. What I'm going to be showing you, there's actually a great walkthrough on this on the Flow community blog by Steven Cislano. Shows you exactly how to do this, how to build nested flows with the HTTP action. So as you can see in this diagram here, we have a parent flow 1. So when a file is added to document library A, we want to call this HTTP endpoint and execute this child flow, which has an approval process. And we want to do the same thing in this other flow. When a document is added to document library B, call that same HTTP endpoint and run that same approval process, the same child flow. So let's jump back to Flow here. Now the first step to make this work is we need to create our child flow, being the approval flow. As you can see, I've already did that here. I created this doc approval flow, and I just did a new blank flow to make this happen. So I'm going to edit this and we'll see what we have here. For the trigger, we did a response. So when an HTTP request is received. When we do that, and after we save this, it actually generates an endpoint for us that we can call in the parent flows. So as we can see, this flow is pretty basic. We have the HTTP request when it's received, and we're doing a simple approval process. Now we talked about JSON earlier. The key to making this work is in the JSON. We need to define our key value pairs. So from our parent flow, we need to pass in the name of the file, a link to the file, and who is requesting this approval. So all we're doing here is defining that JSON object for a name of type string, a link of type string, and a requester of type string. And then we're starting an approval process. Now notice in the title on my dynamic content, I have those objects that I defined above in my JSON schema. I have the name, the link, and the requester, so I can use these in my approval process. I can pass in the title, the name of the document, the link to the document, and the name of the requester. I'm also using that requester name down below in my if it's approved or rejected section when I'm sending an email that the document was approved or rejected back to the requester. So that's step 1. Now we need to actually call this HTTP request from our parent flows. So if I go here to SharePoint, you can see that I have a document library called inspections. I want to create a new flow called inspection workflow, going new, create from blank. Now I've already did this. So the trigger is when a file is created in SharePoint. I'm pointing that to my inspections library. And here is where I'm using that HTTP request action. If I click the plus and add action, I'll just search for HTTP here and select the HTTP option. The first thing you need to fill out is the method. Since we're needing to call another flow to make it execute, that's going to be a post method. Now we need the URI. The URI is back in our child flow, our doc approval flow. The URI is going to be this URL here, the HTTP post URL. There's a shortcut to copy that here. We can go back to this flow and paste that in. Okay. Now the only thing that we need is the body. Now remember, in our child flow here, we had this JSON object for name, link, and requester. We need to copy that same JSON object here. So we need an open bracket, name in quotes, colon, and we're actually passing in some of the dynamic content from our file properties. So we want it for the name, we want to pass in the file name with extension. And again, make sure this is in quotes. And we'll do a comma in our link property. And we'll use the link to item dynamic property in quotes, comma, for our requester property, we will pass in the created by email. That's all we have to do for this. So let's just test that out here. We're back to our SharePoint library. Let's upload a file. Let's see, upload this PDF here. Okay, looks like that uploaded. Now if I refresh this page, I should see a new item here. Great. Looks like it succeeded. There's the email. Please approve document. Notice it got me in as the requester and the link to the item to approve. So I can click approve on here. Confirm that. Got the email that it was approved. If I go into my doc approval, here's that succeeded method, so I can see that a request was received. The outputs being the name of the document I uploaded, the link to the document, and the requester started the approval process. It was approved. So let's expand upon that flow we just set up for the document approval. So we've looked at how we can use the HTTP action to call another flow. Now let's see how we can actually call an API with the HTTP action and return data to a Power App. So for this demo, I'm going to call the Nutrition IX API from Flow and return that nutrition information to a Power App that I have. Let's take a look. So here's the app. As you can see, very simple. I have a landing screen with a scan button. The scan button, when I click it, is going to execute the built-in barcode scanning functionality of my phone. As you can see, I have a bag of Planters peanuts. I scan that barcode. It executes the flow calls the API and returns the nutrition information. So I have the calories, 280, 13 carbs, 7 grams of sugar. We got a nice happy smiley face because this is a relatively healthy item. Can do the same thing again. Scan another item here. In this case, I have a bag of almonds. I can find the barcode. You got to have the barcode just right. Get it positioned right in the right side there, but you see as soon as you get it positioned right, executes very fast, returns the image and the nutrition information. So now that we see how the app functions, let's take a look and see how we made that happen. We'll dissect the flow and the Power App and the API. The first step to getting this solution to work is to sign up for a developer account on the Nutrition IX website. Just search for Nutrition IX in your browser and it should be the first result that pops up. If you click the API option in the search results, you'll be taken to the API page where you can sign up for a free account. That's one of the reasons why I like this particular nutrition API is it is free. You get several calls per month for free. You do have to sign up, give them your email address and your name, and you'll get an API ID and key that you will use to call their nutrition service. The other reason I'm a fan of this particular API is the documentation is pretty well laid out. Once you get logged in and get your API key, you'll go to the docs and you'll see that there's a search item REST endpoint that we can call and pass it in a UPC code and return the nutrition information. That's what we're going to be using for this app. Now that we have our API key and the REST endpoint figured out, let's take a look at the flow. As you can see here, I have a flow called Get Nutrition Info. The trigger for this flow is PowerApps because we are wanting to call this flow from PowerApps when we click the scan button. After the trigger, I'm initializing several variables. These variables will hold the nutrition information such as the calories, sugar, carbs, image, and item. After we initialize those variables to store the nutrition information, we're going to call our HTTP request. In the HTTP request, our method will be a GET because we're wanting to call the REST API and get information returned to our app. For the URI, that's where we'll put in the REST endpoint that we got from our documentation. The last part of that REST endpoint is UPC equals. After the equal, we'll want to insert dynamic content and insert an Ask in PowerApps option. This will allow us to return information to the flow from PowerApps and pass in that scanned barcode or UPC code. The last thing we have to do in this is fill out a couple headers. The headers required for this particular API are XAppID, which you will get when you sign up for that developer account, and XAppKey. You'll create the headers for those and put in your app ID and your app key. That's all that's needed for the HTTP request. So if you remember from the beginning of this session, we talked about how the HTTP request calls a REST API. The REST API returns the data in a JSON format. Now this raw JSON format isn't going to be user-friendly for us for our app. We need to extract out of that JSON just the information we need, like the calories and the carbs and all of that. So to do that, we need to use a flow action called Parse Json. If you type Parse Json in there, for the content, we're going to want to use the body from our HTTP request. So we want to parse that body of the HTTP request. And the next thing we have to do is define a schema so it knows how the information is supposed to be returned. So how do we get this schema that we need? We turn back to our good buddy Postman. So we can pass in that same API call into Postman. We can go back to their documentation and grab one of their sample UPC codes to use. So we have something to pass it in to get the nutrition information for. So I'll take this almonds, for example, and we'll just fill out the header information, the app ID, and the app key again, and press send, and this will return a sample JSON response for the nutrition information for this particular product. So what we can do is copy this JSON response, and we can go back to our flow and use this for the sample schema. So back here in our Parse Json action and flow, we can click the Use Sample Payload to Generate Schema option, and a dialog box will pop up, and this is where we can paste in that JSON object that we got from Postman. If we click Done on this screen, Flow will automatically generate the appropriate schema based on what we pasted in. As you can see, we have our key value pairs for our calories and our quantities and other nutrition information here. One thing I do want to point out here is if for any reason when you call the REST API and the item that you pass in doesn't have a value for, say, saturated fat or total fat or any of these properties that you're returning, the flow will actually error out. Now that's because we're not allowing for those empty values right now. So in the JSON, we're expecting saturated fat to turn a value of type integer. If it returns a value of null, that's not an integer and it errors out. Thankfully, it's pretty easy to allow for these null values and get around that error. What we can do is wrap the type into square blocks and do a comma null in quotes. This will not only allow the type of integer information, but also allow for null. So as long as you wrap your values in that, it will allow null and you won't have to worry about the flow erroring out. All right, so we've got most of the hard stuff out of the way. So all that's really left now is to set the values of those variables that we initialized earlier in the flow. So if we do a set variable action for each of the different variables like calories, carbs, sugar, and image, we're going to want to set those values to the properties from our Parse Json. So if we look at Parse Json for calories, for example, we'll find a appropriate calories value, and we'll set that for the calories, and we'll just repeat those steps for carbs, sugar, image, and name. So just find the appropriate map properties in your Parse Json function and map those to your variables there. All right, guys, we're on the home stretch for this flow here. The last step, insert a respond to PowerApps action. Build your output variables, map those to the variables we created earlier for calories and carbs and all that, and this will return the data to PowerApps for us to use. Save this. Now let's go take a look at how to make this work from the PowerApps side of things. So this Power App is fairly simple. We just have two screens, a welcome screen that allows the user to scan the barcode, and a detail screen that returns the nutrition information. If we look at the scan button and examine its onSelect property, this is how we're actually calling the flow for this particular app. On the onSelect property, I'm setting a global variable called var nutrition scan. The value of this variable is going to be the results from our flow run. So as you can see, I'm calling the get nutrition info flow. I'm running it, and we do that by clicking action and flows, and that will show up on the right hand side. So I'm running our flow and I'm passing in the scan barcode. Scan barcode uses the native barcode scanning functionality of your phone. It will enable the camera, scan the barcode, and return the appropriate UPC value. Then all I'm doing is using a navigate function to navigate the user to the Candy detail screen to see the nutrition information. Now that we've executed our flow, passed in the barcode, the flow is running. Now let's take a look at the detail screen and see how we're returning the results from our flow. As you see here, I have a few labels for calories, carbs, and sugar. If we look at the text value of these labels, I'm just using the var nutrition scan variable, which holds our flow data, and I'm doing a dot sugar or dot carbs or dot calorie. Those are the properties that we determined in our flow that we could return back to PowerApps. So if I do a dot here, I will see all the options that I have: the image, the name, the sugar, and the calories. So that's basically it for the PowerApps side of things. So now we have that fully functioning app that we saw at the beginning. We can scan a barcode. It will call the flow, which the flow calls the API to return the nutrition information, and we pass it back and display it here in our app. So that's all I have for this session. I hope you found it helpful. Hopefully you have a good understanding of what an HTTP request is, how you can utilize that to help you with your flows and PowerApps. If you'd like to follow me on social media, again, my Twitter handle is @AprilDunnam. My blog is sharepointsiren.com. There are a few useful links, one for how to implement the nested flow with HTTPAction functionality I demoed, and there's another link for architecting long-running flows. This is a great walkthrough and use case to show you how to utilize the HTTP action to get around the 30-day run limit on flows. So you can actually call the flow after the expiration date and kick it off again. Pretty cool article to check out. Hopefully you can stick around for the rest of the online flow conference. Lots of great sessions still ahead. Specifically, if you want to learn more about APIs, I believe Mr. Shane Young has a session on using Flow to drive your car and interact with APIs, so make sure to check that one out. Thanks for joining me and have a great day.